please join me in welcoming Sam MacRoberts.
I can honestly say, without any reservations, that I have the best job in the entire universe. What I do every morning is sit down and litigate for liberty. And liberty takes a lot of different forms, and it's a concept that has been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. And in fact, there's been a thread for the last 300 years about what is liberty. We hear these phrases such as, give me liberty or give me death. We hear phrases like, don't tread on me. We hear phrases when we did the Pledge of Allegiance. One nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And this concept started about 300 years ago with John Locke. And John Locke indicated that these were God-given rights and that governments were created and governments exist to protect liberty, to make sure that we have liberty and that it cannot be taken away from us. And he created the phrase, essentially, that natural rights exist. And there's this common thread from John Locke all the way to today. And one of the things I want to tell you about is the Declaration of Independence and the similarities between that document and the Kansas Constitution. So in the Declaration of Independence, we've heard this. I keep a copy with me wherever I go. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Fast forward to the Kansas Constitution. In the Kansas Constitution Bill of Rights, Section 1, it says, all men are possessed of equal and inalienable natural rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. How amazing is that the framers of the Kansas Constitution sat down when they were trying to determine what our state wanted to be and what it needed to be, and they took language almost word for word from the Declaration of Independence. It shows that Kansas, through its documents, is committed to liberty. The second portion of the Declaration of Independence, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. In Kansas, all political power is inherent in the people, and all free governments are founded on their authority and are instituted for their equal protection and benefit. That's the second section of the Kansas Constitution Bill of Rights. So it's clear when the framers sat down, they wanted Kansans to be free. They wanted Kansas to be a liberty state. They wanted to make sure that politicians understood that they exist to make sure we are free people, not the other way around. That the people don't exist at the benefit of politicians, but that the politicians work for us. So as I was preparing for this speech, I know what I think liberty means, and I'm sure everyone in this room has their own kind of definition of liberty, but I thought it was important to actually take a look. What does it mean? What does liberty mean? The quality or state of being free. Freedom from arbitrary or despotic control. The positive enjoyment of various social, political, and economic rights and privileges. Then I started thinking, why is that important? Do politicians in the Kansas legislature sit down every day and think about liberty? When they're looking at bills, when they're looking at laws, do they care about liberty? So from my perspective, that's not what's important, because what's important to most politicians, not all, but most politicians is votes, getting reelected, raising money, and power. And so for that reason, liberty is not being focused on. It's not about the quality or state of being free. It's not about following the Declaration of Independence. It's not about even following the Kansas Constitution. Because if you were to sit down on every bill that comes through and ask the legislature, is this consistent with the Kansas Bill of Rights? Is it consistent with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? And when you pose that question, I think you would get a perplexed response. It would be, I've never really thought about that. But that's the very thing that should be thought about on a daily basis in Topeka and, for that matter, Washington, D.C. So what's happened is over the years, bills get passed, regulations get passed, bureaucracy builds up layer after layer. There are more state agencies, there are more rules, there are more regulations. The agencies are in charge of passing even further regulations, which end up harming the economy, which end up hurting people's right to liberty, which ends up hurting people's right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And when the political process works in that way, what's left to do? What can you do? You can sue. That's what you can do. You can file a declaratory action in court, and you can stand up with one person, the Kansas Justice Institute, and say, Judge, this violates Section 1 of the Kansas Constitution Bill of Rights. This law violates life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And you can make that argument in court, so it's one person with one judge against the entire state of Kansas. And it works. And you can actually start framing the debate and changing the way we're thinking about things because of litigation, because we're litigating for liberty. Which brings me to specifically the Kansas Justice Institute and what we're here for. So our job, again, is to make sure that we keep the government in check on a daily basis. Where we see the government has overstepped their bounds, where they've violated someone's constitutional rights, where they have injured businesses, where they pass laws that don't make sense, and there's despotic control, we're interested in filing a lawsuit. Because we want to return the power back to the people, and we want to make sure that through litigation, people are freer and have more liberty than ever before. I'm sure that's somewhat of a surprise. How many people here actually like lawyers? Whoa, there's 3 or 4, 5. That's part of my mission, is to change your perception of lawyers. Because what we're doing is fighting on behalf of all of you. So one of the things, I've been practicing law since 2006. I went to the University of Kansas for undergrad and for law school. I started practicing in Kansas City doing insurance defense, pretty exciting stuff. And then I started doing civil rights defense and also doing civil rights litigation. I moved away and lived in Hawaii for about 8.5 years. And while I was there, there were 2 cases in particular that I'm most proud of, and are perfectly applicable to the Kansas Justice Institute and kind of illustrates my passion for fighting for the little person against the government. So I lived on the island of Maui, and there was a newspaper publisher who was driving along the highway, and the police were conducting basically roadside stops. And obviously Maui is pretty small, and what was happening was these 2 police officers were causing a backup of traffic all the way through the town, up the mountain. And so the newspaper publisher pulled over to the side and started filming all the traffic stops. And the police officers didn't like that. So they started saying things like, go over here, and then he would go over here, and they would say, no, go over there. So he started moving over here. Then they said, no, you need to back up. So he backed up. And then eventually, the police officers arrested him for filming. We thought, well, there's no way that the prosecutors are actually going to charge this newspaper publisher with a crime. And they did. And then we thought, well, there's no way they're going to keep prosecuting this newspaper publisher for filming the police, because everybody knows you have a First Amendment right to engage in those sort of activities. And they did prosecute him. And they continued prosecuting him. And we had hearings on the case, and I vigorously fought on behalf of this newspaper publisher. We hired an expert witness who does media law. He flew in from New York to the little island of Maui and testified in this court. And eventually, we won the case at the trial court level. his rights were vindicated, or so we thought. The prosecutors appealed the dismissal of the case. So we had to brief the case at the Hawaii Intermediate Court of Appeals, which of course takes time, it takes money. This whole time he's got this prosecution weighing over his head, and we thought, we're not giving in on this. This is too important of a right. And we lost at the Intermediate Court of Appeals. And we thought, oh my gosh, I can't believe this. It never even crossed our mind to fold up shop though. We thought we're gonna take this to the Hawaii Supreme Court. So we briefed it and we fought in front of the Hawaii Supreme Court and eventually won the case in Hawaii under First Amendment principles and the equivalent in Hawaii of the free speech clause. And we created new law. Thank you. We created new law in the state of Hawaii specifically articulating that you have the right to film police officers. That case, and the civil case, lasted almost 8 years. And that's what it took to vindicate somebody's First Amendment rights. And it was during that process that I really became committed to what we're doing. And when I was talking to James and KPI, I laid it all out saying, hey, I'm your guy, because I'm going to sit here and I'm going to fight for these constitutional provisions. I've done it in the past, and now I want to do it at home. I want to come back to where my family grew up, and I want to do it here for Kansans. And again, like I said, it took almost 8 years to finish that case. Another case we did in Hawaii was there was a government employee, pretty minor level, and he created a Facebook page essentially lampooning a famous police officer, or more like an infamous police officer in Hawaii. And this police officer would write more parking tickets than any other person in the entire state. So what happened was, on his free time, not while he was getting paid, he created this Facebook page. Well, somebody turned him in for creating a Facebook page. He was hit with basically harassment charges through the county. He was demoted, he was suspended, he was supposed to go through all of these things. And we ended up fighting for him with other lawyers. We fought for him to get him back his job. So what's important to think about, yes, he's got his constitutional rights, but think about the levels of even the smallest county government in the middle of the Pacific going after someone for making a Facebook page. And if it can happen there, in the middle of the Pacific, you know it's happening here in Kansas, and you know it's happening in Wichita, and Goodland, and Hayes, and in Kansas City, Kansas. And so that experience that I have had there, I'm applying it daily to here at the Kansas Justice Institute. So we started the Kansas Justice Institute back in late March of last year. And we sat down and we thought about the issues that were important to us. And after talking to people and groups like this, we thought the things that are important are economic rights, property rights, free speech, asset forfeiture reform, criminal justice reform when it makes sense. And all of those things have a common thread, which is we're going to get involved in litigation. Like I said, that's going to help people and their businesses and fighting these unnecessary and ridiculous regulations. So the first case that we did was Mark and Coraline Bunner v. Mike Beam. And you might have heard it. Mark and Coraline are small, very small goat farmers near Pfeiffer, Kansas, which is near Hayes. And Mark and Coraline have been producing raw milk for 25 years. And it was a family affair for the Bunners. They had their daughters out there helping with the goats, and it truly was their life. I think Coraline's license plate says Goat Mom. That's how much she loves goats and loves raw milk. Mark and Coraline couldn't talk about raw milk away from their farm. For probably 50 years, there was a statute on the books that said you can produce raw milk, but you can't talk about raw milk away from the farm. And I traveled around the state talking to small raw milk farmers, and we're talking like 5 goats, 6 goats, 1 cow, 2 cows. And they were legitimately afraid that the Secretary of Agriculture would come in if they were to talk about raw milk and put them in jail because it was an unclassified misdemeanor. And it was heartbreaking because these families who spent all of their time producing this product would go away from the farm and someone would say, what do you do with all that milk? And they couldn't say a word. They just had to stand there. And some people started talking in stories, saying, oh, when I was a kid, my parents used to have raw milk, and they used to sell it in the hopes that a person would say, well, let me come back to your farm. Think about how insulting that is for those small dairy farmers. Think about if you couldn't talk about your job. It would be a crime for me to get up here and talk to you under a law like that. I couldn't tell you what Kansas Justice Institute does. That doesn't make any sense. So we sat down with the Bunners and we talked long and hard about fighting this law. And we did. And what we did was we sent a demand letter to the Attorney General saying, this is unconstitutional, it's not right, and we expect you to do the right thing and agree with us that it's unconstitutional. And lo and behold, the Attorney General said, we agree with you, we will sign a consent judgment. So probably 30 to 45 days after we sent this demand letter, we filed a consent judgment, and the judge signed off declaring that raw milk advertising ban unconstitutional, and the Bunners were immediately able to talk about their product away from their farm. And it was so amazing because Mark sent me his business card. And for the first time after we won this case, Mark was able to actually go around and say, I'm Mark Bunner, I sell raw milk. And he could talk about it with pride, the way he should have been able to do for the last 25 years that he was making raw milk. So how has the government responded to that? There's now a bill being introduced to ban raw milk. There's a bill to ban raw milk. In my opinion, they're doing it to shoot one across our bow. To say, okay, you won this free speech case, now we'll ban the product. Can you believe that? So of course, we're now fighting that. And we expect to fight it to the very end, just like I did with the newspaper publisher's case, with the government employees case, and Mark and Cornelia Bunner's case. We're not going to sit down and let the government do that to the small raw milk farmers in Kansas. George alluded to another case that we have done, which is an asset forfeiture case. We filed a brief in the United States Supreme Court on behalf of Milagros Salgado. This is a terrible case where the DEA raided Ms. Salgado's home. They had a mistaken tip, but that didn't stop them from going into the home and taking her entire life savings. What they did was they took her life savings away from her and froze her money. It was $15,000, and it was every penny that she had. And for years, they would not give it back to her. And the DEA agents admitted under oath that they had no reasonable basis to take the money or keep the money because it became clear that they were in the wrong. But they still didn't return her money. They said it was forfeitable, meaning they get to take it nonetheless. And there's a provision under the asset forfeiture laws that says if the person whose money has been taken prevails or substantially prevails in that case, then the government has to pay that person's attorney's fees. Makes sense. Ms. Salgado's attorney filed a motion to dismiss, filed all these motions, and it became clear to the government and everyone else that Ms. Salgado was going to win. Meaning, the federal government was going to have to pay Ms. Salgado's money for her attorney's fees and give her back her money. So what did they do? They dismissed the case on the eve of trial so they wouldn't have to pay her attorney's fees. Which means the $15,000 that she had went to, a great portion of it, went to pay her attorney. So for years she fought the United States government and lost. And she lost at the trial court level, and she lost at the Court of Appeals level, and now she's asking the United States Supreme Court to overturn what happened in her case. And we filed an amicus brief asking the court, more like telling the court, you need to take this case up. Please do it on behalf of Ms. Salgado, but on behalf of making this right for everyone else who is victimized by the federal government. So that's just the tip of the iceberg in what Kansas Justice Institute is doing and what we want to do. I'm happy to listen to any case suggestion, but here are a couple of things that we are very interested in and we are pursuing in one form or another. So in Kansas, there's different types of advanced practice registered nurses. And you go to school, you get your degree, you get your license to be an advanced practice registered nurse, but you're unable to become a nurse unless a physician signs what's called a collaborative practices agreement. And the physician doesn't have to actually supervise the nurse, doesn't have to do anything other than lend their name to this document. And we have been told that some physicians are charging up to $100,000 for the nurse just to be able to be a nurse. And the nurse has already paid for their undergraduate degree, their nursing degree, they've gone to school, they passed their boards. So why in the world do they have to have a physician sign a permission slip for them to do their job, especially when they're charging $100,000? Another one that's similar is, and this is all in the context of occupational licensing. And so occupational licensing is, my opinion, it's unreasonable restrictions on the right to someone, the right of someone to be able to have gainful employment. And most of the time, the reason these regulations are passed is under the auspices of public health and public safety. But really what it's about is economic protectionism. So what happens is boards are created with people who already have a job, and then they create onerous regulations to prevent people from actually getting the same type of job, which then artificially increases what the board people can charge customers. And in one, in my opinion, egregious example is for eyebrow threading. I'd never heard of eyebrow threading until somebody told me about this. So people take cotton threads, okay? Normal cotton threads that you see at a store. And you basically twist it up and you can groom someone's eyebrows with cotton thread. And it's practiced in Asia and has for hundreds of years. The Kansas Board of Cosmetology forces people to go to the cosmetology school, which can cost up to $30,000, spend thousands of hours to be a cosmetologist, and there's only 1 or 2 hours tops devoted to eyebrow threading. And if you were to take this eyebrow and groom it with cotton thread without a license, you could go to jail. And to me, it's all about economic protectionism. It's the board saying, we don't want people to do eyebrow threading. One case that I think is particularly interesting is we've been hearing that people who live near polling locations have been putting election signs on their property. And if they're within 150 or 200 feet from the polling location, somebody will come in and pull up their yard sign and tell them you can't put up a yard sign in your own property because you're too close to a polling location. And so from my perspective, that's particularly egregious because you have a First Amendment right to put up a yard sign, but you also have property rights. That's your property. You can put up a sign if you want to. And a related note, I think I see a Make America Great hat again. There we go in the back right. It's a crime to wear that hat when you vote, which doesn't make any sense to me, because if you're not in there trying to actively persuade someone, or you're not actually trying to prevent someone from voting for another candidate, why can't you wear your own hat at a polling location when you're casting your ballot? That doesn't make any sense to me. And the federal government, the United States Supreme Court, has decided these types of cases under the First Amendment. And so one of the things Kansas Justice Institute wants to do is breathe life back into the Kansas Constitution. So we have our own free speech clause in Kansas, Section 11 of the Kansas Constitution Bill of Rights, that is worded completely differently from the First Amendment. So what we want to do is start bringing free speech cases not under the First Amendment, but under the Kansas Constitution. And one of the things we're going to argue is you have more rights and more freedom and more liberty under the Kansas Constitution than you do under the United States Constitution. So even if the First Amendment says we don't really have a right to wear that hat in the polling location, our argument is the Kansas Constitution does. So I guess I'll leave you with a couple other quick ones. I looked up a Wichita ordinance. And there were a bunch that I thought were mind-boggling, but I didn't want to spend the entire time going through every ordinance that I thought was egregious. But there's one that I thought was pretty bad. So here in Wichita, if you are a mobile food vendor, you cannot park within 150 feet of a restaurant unless you get that restaurant owner's permission, which you're never going to be able to get, because the restaurant owner doesn't want the mobile food truck parked anywhere near you. So you have to actually have your competitor's permission to do business. And that, to me, is the opposite of liberty. Same thing with starting moving companies in Kansas. Before you start a moving company, you have to have your competitor's permission. So think about people who are moving into Kansas. They're so excited to start their business, and then they have to ask every moving competitor, oh, can we start this business? And of course, what are they going to say? No. I appreciate you having me here. I would love to hear any thoughts you have or any questions. I will try not to answer them like a lawyer, but that's who I am, so we'll see how it goes.
Thank you very much. In the limited time we have, we're going to start with our members and guests, but please try to keep it short. If you try to frame a case, let's do it after, but at least indicate what your case is about, and we'll start with this question.
Sam, just real quick, you mentioned a number of employment restrictive cases. Can you tell us where Kansas ranks amongst all the states in the number of restrictions that we have on employment?
Pretty bad. That's the short answer. I know the Kansas Chamber has done a lot of work on this. I know Americans for Prosperity has done a lot of work on this. I know Kansas Policy Institute has done a lot of work on this. The numbers kind of vary, George, but we're not as bad as some states, but we certainly have a lot of pretty egregious occupational licensing regimes. I know, or I'm pretty sure that in Louisiana, for example, you have to have a license to be able to arrange flowers. In other states, you have to have a license to be able to shampoo someone's hair. So Kansas is getting close to being that bad, but not quite as bad as that. I don't think you need a florist license in Kansas yet.
Next question.
In the case of the goat farmers, do they pasteurize their milk? And if so, what is the opposition to selling raw milk?
So I'll answer the second part first. The opposition to selling raw milk, to me, is it's grade A dairies having to compete with raw milk producers. So that's really the biggest option, or the biggest hurdle. From my perspective, it seems that that's the only reason for doing this. The Bunners originally built their facility to meet the specifications of a grade A dairy, and they spent a lot of money for their for all of the equipment, for the milking parlor itself, and then they realized they liked raw milk better than pasteurized milk, and the people in their community preferred raw milk over pasteurized milk. So even though they spent the money to have a grade A pasteurized dairy, the marketplace told them to go towards raw milk, and that's what they did. But I can't for the life of me understand why somebody would oppose a producer and a consumer, if they understood what's going on, to allow them to drink raw milk, as they've been doing for probably 100 years.
Right back over here.
Yeah, Have you ever done any DCF cases, and if not, thought about maybe like a class action suit? Since foster kids that age out of the system tend to be like 95% of them end up on welfare, and as many as 80% of them end up in jail or in prison, and it seems like there's a case there for something.
So I have done work with minors before and juveniles, but I have never done a class action suit like that. And I know that wasn't exactly your question. Right now, Kansas Justice Institute is one lawyer, me. So putting forth a class action lawsuit wouldn't work at this time. But I'm definitely interested in understanding more about the topic, and if people have specific issues, I would invite them to give me a call, and I'm happy to talk to them about it.
What I wanted to bring up was actually a book that's called The Right to Earn a Living. And one of the examples in there is, all kinds of great examples, but dealing with taxi cabs in places like New York, where they control, the current operators control the market by pursuing licensing, and the new people wanting to come in have to pay an exorbitant amount of money for the licensing. Have you run onto this in Kansas?
So I'm familiar with the taxi cab medallions issue, and that has been litigated in a lot of different areas. And I think Institute for Justice did a case in Manhattan dealing with a really similar issue. And last I saw, a taxi medallion was over $1 million. So if somebody wanted to break into the taxi cab business in New York, they would have to unload more than $1 million to be able to drive a taxi. So that's a kind of a short answer, but yes, I am very attuned to the issue. I am interested in that issue. I'm interested in talking to people who have been prohibited from exercising a job that they want to have.
Well, in Kansas, you mentioned the cosmetology thing, and I understand that the hair braiding, the cornrows and all that people were doing that for friends or acquaintances in their home and charging a little minimal amount for it, or they pay them for it, and then the cosmetology school says, no, you can't do that without going to school, even though they didn't teach that.
Right. They did say at first you can't do it, and then the legislature specifically exempted hair braiders. So now there's a specific exemption for that, which then makes me believe, why aren't they doing the same thing for eyebrow threaders? And if they're not doing it for eyebrow threading, then that's a good opportunity for us to move forward with potential litigation.
Okay, our next question back here.
Yes, sir. We have immigrants that are here illegally, and I stress illegally means they're not supposed to be here. What liberties do they have other than should they be handcuffed and taken across the border? Is that the only liberty I think they should have?
Well, I think that is such an interesting question, because the courts have struggled with that very question for a long time, and they haven't decided what rights should be granted and what rights shouldn't. And that's going to be a continuing topic for years to come, and I have no idea how that's going to come out.
So as you know, the Kansas Chamber is working on occupational licensure bill along with you as well. So I often hear pushback from people with professional licenses that theirs is different from occupational licensing. I've read through statute after statute. I can't find any legal differentiation. It seems more like just semantics, professional versus occupational. Help me understand that.
I can't. It is semantics. Okay. That's all it is.
All right.
And
excuse me while I go tell somebody.
Right. No, I mean, it's professionals who just think they're better than everyone. It's like I tell people all the time, I'm just a regular Joe who's got a license. That's all I am.
Another question. So I know you didn't come here for this, but it sounds like it takes money to make this happen, and I just wonder how you fund it, and maybe how folks here that believe in this could help with it.
So we are a 501c3, and thankfully my job is to litigate as opposed to fundraise, but I'm sure James Franco and George Bruce could, they might even corner you before you get out of here, so they will talk to you for sure. Thank you for asking that question.
As a major critic of the Kansas Supreme Court, I followed Article 4, Section 4 of the U.S. Constitution that guarantees, this is with a small r, each state is guaranteed a Republican form of government. And I know that our state Supreme Court is not the only one that's out of control in all 50 states. Is there any litigation that you're aware of involving efforts to litigate the idea that we've got state Supreme Courts that are in violation of the U.S. Constitution and the guarantee of a Republican form of government and not a judicial oligarchy?
So I will probably be appearing before the Kansas Supreme Court at some point soon, so let me answer that question succinctly. Yes, I have heard of litigation, and I think it's in West Virginia. So I have heard of something along those lines. And I don't know if it's in the, I don't know if the suit was filed in state court or in federal court, and I don't know if it's in the Court of Appeals, but I have run across cases where that argument's being raised.
Do you consider the real estate business to be kind of a self, or industry or agency or licensing and all that to be kind of a self-protectionist segment that might not be broken up?
So I don't necessarily think that licensing needs to be broken up, but I think that we need to pay careful attention to what the licensing regime does and what the purpose of it is and how it affects people who are trying to become whatever it is that's being regulated. And so I think that there probably are good licensing schemes, but it's important that Kansas Justice Institute pays attention to that. And so when we see a scheme doesn't make sense, that's where we'd want to litigate. But there surely has to be a good scheme somewhere.
Sam, we talked a little bit earlier about the administrative state where non-elected governmental officials actually legislate, they create laws, they adjudicate, and so they're essentially acting as legislative and judicial. Is there an opportunity for litigation in that area to push back on that? Are you looking for that sort of case?
Absolutely, and yes. It is a major problem because there are boards who don't realize what they're doing, and the public doesn't really understand what's happening, and the rules and regulations are very Kafkaesque. And so you've got these boards creating rules and then interpreting their own rules, and then if a person is deemed to be in violation of those rules, there's nobody really to appeal to except for the same board that created and interpreted the rules to begin with. And so it's a major problem, and we are very interested in that issue.
One other thing, I'm involved in trying to work on the metal theft things here in town and in the state, and the legislature last year inadvertently amended the Kansas scrap dealers statute so that if there's wording in there that makes it so that the Attorney General is the only person that can prosecute or do anything about scrap metal, and they basically told the city and the county that they can't do that, and it doesn't seem constitutional.
That's interesting. I have not run across that. I'd love to talk to you about that afterwards. That's, like I said, that's interesting. I'm not familiar with that, though.
Okay, we talked a few minutes ago about the Blair situation. I think I saw a hand raised over here in this area. I didn't overlook you intentionally. One question that we can ask in case any of you want to frame up a question, how are you dealing with the student and the issues on some campuses regarding freedom of speech, freedom of discourse?
I've been asked that question at every event I've gone to, and I actually had it in my notes to address it during my speech. I am really interested in how universities are dealing with club membership, how they are restricting students' right to protest, or I'm really interested in schools when there's a conservative speaker who comes and then there's so many protests and it's getting so out of control that then you can't actually bring the conservative speaker to the school, and then how does the university or school deal with that? I'm very interested in that, and I would love to talk to anybody who has any knowledge about students who are being affected by that. It's hard for me to get down to a student and talk to a student about that, because students don't know lawyers really. They don't know who to call. And a lot of times I'm not talking to students. I'm talking to this group. And so if anybody has somebody who's in college who's being affected by these things, then I absolutely want to talk to them. It's a problem, and there's a specific group that deals with free speech on campuses, and I have talked to them saying, hey, we're ready to rock and roll when you guys are.
I'm just wondering about the feasibility of passing a law. So if a person wins in a court case against the government, that they would be reimbursed for all their expenses in litigation.
Well, if I understood your question correctly, is it feasible? It is, because what happens is when the lawyer, I'm assuming you're talking about the Mulata Salgado case, what happens in a matter like that is the lawyer keeps track of his time and his hourly rate. And so in his case, I wish I would have written down how much time that lawyer spent on it. My recollection is that he spent hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of time on behalf of Ms. Salgado and ended up getting paid like $5,000 to $6,000. So for him, it wasn't worth taking the case. For Ms. Salgado, it wasn't really worth having a lawyer take the case, because now she's lost, almost all of her life savings, and the government understands that, and that's why they do it. Because it makes it very difficult then for anybody to help people like Ms. Salgado. And so that's why the Supreme Court, in my opinion, should take that case up, to really hold the government accountable, saying you can't do that to people.
We are working I mentioned for like a while ago, a petition for, in Kansas law, as I understand it, citizens have the right to initiate ordinances for their cities, and we're doing that right here in Wichita, Kansas. The question that's asked, and we're hearing back from city staff, that are we administrative or are we legislative? And they're already trying the case basically before we even get to it. Are you familiar with these type of cases in Kansas? So Kansas have the right to initiate ordinances, and have you heard of any cases along that line?
I think I'd be a horrible lawyer if I just gave you an opinion on that, off the cuff. But there are cases that discuss that, and so we should talk further about it.
Do we have any more questions? Well, I've got one more for you.
All right.
Do you, or can you define the difference between your organization and another, perhaps a little bit older organization that has a very high-sounding name called the ACLU?
Sure.
Some folks may be scratching their heads and saying, "I'll know."
So I think that is a great question that I have talked to a lot of people about, and especially telling my parents the job that I took, because they were asking me the same exact thing. What is the difference? I think that the difference is the kinds of cases that we are interested in versus the kinds of cases that the ACLU is interested in. And I think that the ACLU originally was very focused on free speech cases. And I think originally they were willing to represent Ku Klux Klan members, for example. And they were pushing the boundaries of free speech law for a very long time. My sense is that they're not doing the same types of cases that they have done in the past. And they're now more focused on other issues as opposed to, just free speech and things along those lines. I think that it's always fun for me to talk to ACLU people because there is some common ground. When I shared our free speech case with raw milk with the ACLU, they loved it. They thought it was a great case and they encouraged us to do it. I just don't think that that really fits with what they're trying to do at this point in time.
Sam, let me wrap this up with one final question. You're here in Kansas with the great work Kansas Policy Institute's doing, and you're part of that. In the other 49 states, how many other Sam MacRoberts and or organizations are operating at the state level, besides yourself, obviously?
Sure. So I think at last count there were about 12 or 13, and I've made it a point to tried to develop a relationship and friendship with all of the litigation directors. And we call ourselves state-based litigation groups, so I've reached out to them, and I've gone to conferences with them, and we share a lot of case ideas. And one of the things that we talk about are litigation strategies. And one of the things that I failed to mention earlier, part of what we're doing is educating the public. And so even if we lose the court case, what we want to do is win the publicity case. So we can explain to people what the government is doing, how they're interfering with people's lives. And probably one of the best examples was Little Pink House in Connecticut. So the Supreme Court ruled against the lady whose home was eventually taken from her. And it caused such an outrage that then the state legislatures ran back and fixed all of their eminent domain laws where they could. So that's a perfect example of losing the Supreme Court case, but winning the overall battle. And so that's what we're planning on doing. So although we so far are 1 for 1, we won't be undefeated for the rest of my career, and just keep that in mind.
Sam MacRoberts with the Kansas Policy Institute. Thank you.